Well, hello, Tom. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Morning, Gus. How are you?
I'm doing great. Well, I always start these podcasts off in the same way, which is asking you how you found fire and life safety.
All right. My story is that I went to college thinking that I was going to be a dentist. I was actually trying to keep up with my older brother, who was in med school at the time. And I found out that dentistry was not for me. Pre-med and pre-dent back in the 70s was quite a dog-eat-dog situation. And fortunately for me, I had a fellow volunteer firefighter who told me about fire protection engineering. Previously to that, the only degree programs I knew about were associates in fire science. So I looked into the two programs at the time at IIT, which is no longer in existence in Chicago, and the University of Maryland. The prospect of living in a fire station and going to school for fire protection engineering was quite an attraction to a young man at the time that I was. I was already a firefighter, and I wanted to learn more about the FP profession. So I graduated from Fordham University and then went on to get a job at the U.S. Fire Administration. And at the same time, I went part time with, uh, uh, I'm sorry, it was part time at University of Maryland while I was full time at the U.S. Fire Administration. I graduated Maryland in 1986. In those days, some people should know that Dr. Bryan, affectionately known as Prof, ran the program. Dr. Harry Hickey was there, Dr. Jack Watts, and Dr. Jim Milkey. He wasn't a doctor at the time. And they were the core faculty at Maryland. And now I look, fast forward to today, and now we're planning the retirement celebration for Dr. Milkey. So that's kind of how I bumped into this profession.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, Milky, I've heard a lot of really great things about Milky and people who have been working with him at the program. So I know that he is a fixture in the University of Maryland and in the fire protection community. So that's cool. It's cool to hear about. It seems I know that my story is that kind of that mirrors that of starting one way and then having a proclivity for math and science and then finding fire and life safety, and that kind of seems to be a common thread. So I appreciate you telling me and telling the listeners about that. Awesome. Well, so for a little bit more context and just to give the listeners an idea of your background, would you speak about, several of the roles in your career so that people can have an understanding of, what kind of different technical topics you've engaged in and just your professional background?
As I mentioned, I worked at the U.S. Fire Administration. It wasn't exactly engineering, but there were some fire protection engineers there that were important to my early development. Um, But when President Reagan came into office, the fire administration's budget was cut, and so all of us were really looking for another job. And I joined Rolf Jensen Associates. That was in 1982. I was an engineering technician at first because I was still going to Maryland for fire protection engineering, and I was there for a little over 6 years. So I grew from a technician to an engineer, and I was a PE before I left the firm. Working as a consultant taught me something, Gus, that I needed to understand the nuts and bolts of the profession a little better. So I took a project manager position with Grinnell Fire Protection, and that was an amazing experience. It was one thing to tell someone to install something in a certain manner. It's a whole nother thing to be the person installing that and getting it done. Getting material on the job site and handling all that stuff. So I went from a consultant to a contractor because I felt I needed to take a step back and learn some more on the nuts and bolts. I was not there very long, about 2 years, because I did learn a lot. It was a great experience. But at that point, I was like, I need to get back into fire alarm, smoke control, life safety, and that type of thing. So from there, I joined Gage Babcock and Associates in their Washington D.C. office, and I worked there for 10 years. Moved up as most people do over time, and then eventually was offered a position to be the principal in charge of the Atlanta, Georgia office. So moved my family to Atlanta and worked in that position for 3 years. But there was an ownership transition, and it went horribly wrong, and the firm no longer exists today. So unfortunately, I had to move on and find another employer. So I moved over to Shermer Engineering in about 2003, and I opened their Atlanta office and grew it to 15 folks. That was a great experience, about 7 years. Again, I grew quite a lot in that position with a different company, seeing how a competitor does the same thing, but how they do it differently. So I've been at Rolf Jensen, I had been engaged Babcock, and now Shermer. Those are the three big firms when I was in school, and so I saw things from many different angles, and I think it really helped me round me out. But Shermer had a parent company that made some changes that wasn't the best for me, so I looked again, and the Protection Engineering Group was a group of folks that left Gage Babcock when Gage Babcock dissolved and started their own firm. So they were my old cohorts. So I joined them and opened their Atlanta office. And we grew to about 6 people in 5 years, and then we were acquired by GHD. And I spent the next 5 years with GHD in Atlanta. Uh, they called me a team leader. And then I got my dream job here at Harrington Group, smaller firm, uh, focused only on fire protection engineering, and just a really great place to work.
That's awesome. That's cool to hear that you've had such a good variety of experience, ranging from, smaller firms and startups to growing and being part of big organizations. That definitely makes me interested to pick your brain on those transition periods as somebody who works for a four-person firm now that is growing, and I know that you're probably well acquainted with those pains of growing a company and how you have to change hats or pick up different skill sets. So
I always enjoyed being or fancying myself as being what I say, a utility infielder. We always had folks in the firm. Someone was, an expert in fire alarm, an expert in sprinkler or smoke control. Well, if you need another discipline, if you'll call it that, if you need smoke control and your person is just a fire alarm person, you can't tap them to do that. So for my boss, I wanted to be able to, so maybe I was a jack of all trade, master of none. But I felt like, he could turn to me and throw something at me and I could do it.
well, I think that's one of the things that is really exciting about fire protection is that there is so much variety. So I could see how you would be interested in that because the whole field is kind of structured on touching so many aspects of construction. So I love that part too. So I definitely have, yeah, am prone to liking to see a little bit of all of it.
Yeah, someday, I hope the world, when they hear the word fire protection or fire protection engineering, they don't think just water coming out of a sprinkler. It's so much more than that.
Definitely everything that has fire in the name of it or even could be associated with fire. But anyways, for so if you would, what is an example of a couple of projects that you've worked on that were really meaningful or fascinating to you in your career? Because it sounds like you've had a lot of great experience at a variety of firms.
I'll try to limit it, Gus, to because I have so many that I think back on, and they were really cool projects. But one of my first projects after I graduated Maryland was a fire and life safety upgrade for the Pierre Hotel in New York City. It's a beautiful old hotel. I think it was finished right around the time of the Great Depression, and 42 stories. And when they built them back then, the only sprinkler system in that building was on the loading dock and some basement storage areas, not where people were sleeping in that occupancy. So my job, I think it was a local law 16 was the requirement in New York City, was to fully sprinkler the building and replace the fire alarm system, do some lighting upgrades, things like that. We had to add a fire pump, uh, and it was a very interesting job. I was young. I was kind of it was kind of like throw them in the water and see if they can swim kind of thing. A little intimidated by maybe some of the contractors in the New York City area, but it went very well, and it was quite a way to get started. Beautiful old building. Another one that really sticks out in my mind, Gus, is the Social Security Administration has some facilities in Kansas City that are in a cave. These caves were dug to get the minerals and things that were underground, and they leave pieces of the earth there, kind of like columns in a building. After they did that, they poured floors and put up walls and actually made an underground office park outside Kansas City. So Social Security Administration had many, many records there because of the constant temperature and humidity down those depths. So testing a fire alarm system underground, and they had fans in there to move air because the air was just stagnant. So I'm walking away from a fire alarm horn that is operating, and I can hear it. And at some point, I can't tell if it's the horn or is the fan. Um, Issues with testing the sprinkler system. Where does the water go? So that was really really interesting. And we had to look at the storage of paper files. So saying that you worked in a cave, fire protection in a cave is kind of unusual. And I go from that one in my mind to National Archives 2. That was We designed and built that in the early 90s, and that's not in Washington D.C. It sits out at the University of Maryland's campus in Maryland, right outside D.C. in Maryland. It's a 1.75 million square foot archival research facility, state of the art at the time. Uh, so we had to design these systems. They had to be quite robust. They were concerned about the longevity of the piping and things like that. They didn't want to use Schedule 10 and other light wall type pipes. The Nixon tapes are stored in that building. So to be able to say that you worked on something like that, and of course we were concerned with water damage. And back then in the codes, you put hose valves throughout the building such that every part of the building could be reached by 100 feet of hose issuing a 30-foot stream. So those were all throughout the building. And if someone were to surreptitiously open the valve and just cause water damage, so we actually had flow switches on we could tell you if it was a sprinkler system or a hose valve and which one. So really cool. And those were compact mobile shelving units that we see today in a lot of occupancies. There wasn't a lot of guidance on protection of those. So my boss, John O'Neill, who was the chair of NFPA 13 technical committee, went and did testing at UL. And based on that testing, I was given that criteria to design the systems. So there were 23 spaces that were 40,000 square feet apiece that had these compact mobile shelving units. So when the sprinkler system would operate in that space, all the shelving, instead of having an aisle for you to access the material, all the shelves would move so there were just inches between each one so water could get down in there and suppress the fire. Really, really cool thing. Uh, and I'll try to wrap it up here. I know I'm kind of long. But the next one that really sticks out in my mind is the U.S. Capitol complex. They realized that they didn't comply with codes and standards, and then they passed the Congressional Accountability Act, and now they had to go on their horse and ride and start to upgrade their buildings. There's like 30 something buildings on the Capitol Hill complex, over 15 million square feet. A lot of them very old, the Capitol itself, a lot of open stairways and things like that. So I actually worked in the Capitol for 2 years as a contractor with a team of, I think I had 5 or 6 folks with me, and we were trying to upgrade all the fire protection in all those buildings. And it was a monumental task. And there's still, today, the Arctic Capitol has quite a few fire protection engineers on staff. They started with us as a contractor, and then they started growing their staffs with real FPEs. So they're doing a great job there on that. Now I'll switch to another historic building, the Versace Mansion in South Beach, Miami. It was a large home. That's right, it's a mansion. And when Versace died, his sister sold it to uh, a gentleman who turned it into a private hotel. So it was a big house, but it's a small hotel. It was only 12 suites. Well, it wasn't sprinklered and change of occupancy, and the city says you shall sprinkler. And the historic preservationists for the city said, thou shalt not touch the building. So I was the ping pong ball between the two of them, got the state fire marshal involved, and we came up with a way to protect the building. It's not 100% sprinklered, but the state fire marshal went for as much protection we could get while protecting the historic fabric of the building. So that was really, really, really cool. Um, my wife was impressed when she got to go to the mansion with me. And then finally, one that I'm still working on today, Carvana. If you're familiar with them, they sell used cars and they have a tower. And the purpose of that tower is not storage. It's when you buy a car online from Carvana and you want to pick it up at the tower, they'll put that car in the tower the night before or that morning. And the intent is at the end of the day, those cars are gone because everyone came and picked up their car. So the cars that are in the tower are sold. Well, a lot of jurisdictions said, what codes and standards are you looking relief from? And we said, we're not looking for relief from any codes and standards. We are writing the code for this unusual structure that building and fire codes really don't address. Uh, it's a single story structure, very tall. It's like rack storage. It's like a parking garage, but it's not like either. So it was this real unusual animal that we had to come up with a protection scheme. Really, really neat project. And there's, I think, almost 30 of those around the country now.
That's cool. Very incredible. Uh, I am never not impressed when I get the chance with somebody who's been in the field long enough and like the richness of what is available for people to go out and do in fire protection and life safety engineering. Hearing that all the unique experiences like dealing with cave fire protection, which is a unique one for the built environment, or working on the U.S. Capitol, or addressing new fire and life safety hazards and developing standards for protection of unique hazards. I mean, all of that is really interesting. I appreciate you sharing that, Tom. um, Something that's been on my mind a lot recently is like in the Carvana situation, or in, say, the PFAS or PFOA foams, where we have a new emerging hazard in the industry, how to look at those hazards and kind of develop a game plan for protection strategy. But I know I didn't plan to talk to you about this one, but if you had any like thoughts on your approach when looking at a hazard like this, or a new hazard, or maybe deprecated technology, like what do you what is in your mind when you're approaching a new hazard like the Carvana one?
Yeah, with Carvana, we started off saying, what is this like? Can we compare it to, say, a parking garage? Because well, at the time, we thought we knew how to protect parking garages. Today, that's all up in the air too, with the plastics that are changing in our cars. But before all that happened, before the EVs, before the heavy plastics, we were looking at traditional parking garages. What applies to a Carvana tower? What doesn't? Because if something does apply, we kind of know how to protect it. And then again, rack storage. It's kind of like rack storage, but it's not exactly. So we started off and, we were scratching our heads. I had a younger engineer working for me, and he's like, how are we going to do this? And I'm like, I don't know how, but we're going to. So I was kind of uh, saying we've got to do this. I don't want to compare ourselves to the space race, but President Kennedy said we're going to do it, and then a bunch of engineers went and figured it out. That's what I was trying to do with my coworkers. Say is like, I know we can do this. We need to look at all these things. So we sat down and we came up with a plan, and it's amazing as we worked through the plan how some things we thought were going to happen didn't, or oh, we can do this, and when we looked into it, we were like, no, that's not going to work. And then when we thought we had it all, we took our first one to an authority having jurisdiction, and they hit us with a couple of things that we hadn't really thought of. So this Carvana protection, just as an example, uh, it was really it was me and my team, and then it was every time we worked on another HJ, they improved what we were doing. So after a while, we thought we had a pretty good approach, and then EVs come along and heavy plastics in our vehicles, and even NFPA 13 says we're not sure how to protect a parking garage. So it's yeah, it's really neat. You've got to try to not let those biases come in.
Hmm.
I talked about the space race there for a second. I think that does apply too. I listened to a really neat podcast about the space race, which I was really into as a kid, and found out that in mission control, the average age of someone in mission control was 27 years old, and that was on purpose because they knew they were doing something no one had ever done before, and so they didn't want a lot of biases of older engineers like that won't work or this won't work. So they wanted a lot of younger engineers to think outside the box, to use that phrase, and then tempered by some of the older engineers. And they did obviously an amazing thing. So every time, and I used this on that coworker when we started looking at Carvana. How are we going to do this? I said, look, we went to the moon and no one had ever done that before. So let's be engineers and let's engineer this.
That's great. I love that, looking for existing data sources, comparing to areas in the industry where we do have good testing and good information on how to protect hazards. And then, creating a protection strategy and going to the AHJ and vetting that with the local jurisdictions and iterating and improving. And, I think that is the core of what it means to be a fire protection engineer, is being able to develop a strategy when it's not prescriptive. So I appreciate you talking about that, because I think I'm still figuring it out. I'm still learning it. And I think that it's where a lot of the value of our profession is being able to objectively look at a hazard and understand the underlying factors for a protection strategy, and to develop one where it's not clear. So I appreciate that, Tom.
Yeah, you're right on there, Gus. And nothing drives me crazier than when someone says to me, "Well, we've never done that before." Well, at one point in society, we never had a buggy that didn't have a horse in front of it. We didn't fly to the moon. We didn't fly in an airplane. So just because we haven't done it before, I mean, we're engineers. That's what we do.
One of the people I work with said, the logic of that's the way we've always done it is my least favorite logic. Like, that's not a good argument there.
Yeah.
But anyways, I wanted to ask more about, kind of, it seems like you've had a variety of different occupancies and, facility types in your career, but I wanted to ask if you have a specific occupancy or technology in which you have had more focus on in your career, and if so, if you would mind telling me and telling the listeners about that.
Yeah, I guess. Well, an occupancy that I became known for in my first 20 years of my career was healthcare. I was at Gage Babcock and Associates, and part of my job was to be the staff consultant to the American Healthcare Association. That's the Association of Nursing Homes. So in doing that, in representing them, I wound up for them on NFPA 99 healthcare facilities and NFPA 101 board and care facilities, and eventually NFPA 101 for healthcare. Uh, so I provided consulting to the association, representing them at codes and standards meetings. I would respond to a member's nursing home that had a fire. I'm not a cause and origin expert, but I would go to gather facts, because after a fire like that, in the press they'd say, "Oh, this nursing home wasn't sprinklered." Well, often it wasn't required to be sprinklered back then. So we went there to protect them and the association from information that wasn't correct. You know, uh, that led to my involvement in NFPA's healthcare section, where I eventually became the chair of the section. And then in 1998, NFPA approached me and asked me if I'd be the editor of the NFPA 99 handbook, which I did for the 1999 edition and the 2002 edition. The tough thing about being that editor, though, is I said, look, I don't know every part of NFPA 99. I was on their technical correlating committee. So the TCC correlates all the technical committees under them. We're not actually supposed to write code. So I said, look, I don't know all of their stuff in great detail. And they said, well, Tom, you don't have to know all that. You just have to research all their changes, talk to them, and if they made a major change in the code that's important, you might want to write handbook section to explain why and how they did that. So it wasn't an insurmountable task, but afterwards people are like, oh yeah, Tom's the editor of the handbook. He knows it all. You don't really know it all from that position. So but that was a lot of fun to do that for NFPA. And in my second 22 years of my career, I still did healthcare, but not singly focused like it was earlier. Uh, And did a lot of different number of occupancies. I like working in, I don't like working in the same building every day or the type of hazard. It's neat to see new and different stuff, right? Everybody's like that, I think. So the second part of my career, or at least the last 4 years, is really focused on industrial and warehousing. I think we all know today's warehouses are not the warehouses of our dads or our grandfathers. It used to be a big box. You put a bunch of stuff in there, and it just sat there. But today's warehouses are super large, multi-story. Gone are the days of just a limited number of different commodities. Today's warehouses have so many different commodities, hazardous materials, platforms, uh, material handling equipment, and protection of these occupancies is extremely technical. If you told me when I was, you know, 5 years into my career, I'd be doing warehouses and it'd be technical as all get out, I'd be like, "What are you talking about?" But these warehouses today that we're working on at Harrington Group, I'm just amazed every day at some of the complexity of them.
That's awesome. I love. I do a lot of storage and industrial now work now, but I know a lot less about healthcare. So that's cool to hear about your involvement in NFPA 99 and 101. That's really interesting. I like that. Healthcare is the both of those are really challenging occupancy group types, but it makes sense because that's usually where fire protection engineer is looped in anyways. It's not usually a general business specialty for a fire protection engineer because it's not quite gnarly enough for people to think that they can't. So, yeah, I don't want to say anything mean about people who take fire protection lightly, but you know where I'm going with that. Um, yeah, but that's cool. That's cool to hear about. I love the big gnarly challenges are the funnest or the most fascinating to engineer anyways. So it's good to have those specialties.
Yeah, I don't think any engineer wants to just take the same solution and just keep plugging it in. I think that's why we're engineers. It's like, what is it? How can I figure it out? And the heart of the challenge, I think, at least most of the engineers I work with, that's, yeah, give me the harder challenge. Let me see if I can figure that out.
Oh, definitely. I completely agree. Well, Tom, I wanted to. The next section of questions is kind of just all me picking your brain about advice for different things. Really, these are selfish questions for me, but I think that the listeners might like the answers for them as well. Um, so, something we've been talking a lot about internally at the company I work for, and something that I've been trying to grow in myself recently is like a interest in putting quality in documentation or in fire protection engineering design and really focusing on how to build value for the company, the owner, the occupants. And so I just wanted to ask you if you had a piece of advice for um, individuals who are looking to um, promote excellence or provide excellence in their career or in their work product.
Well, Gus, I think excellence in fire protection engineering is, almost like any other engineering discipline. It requires attention to detail, a focus on new and emerging technologies and their application or misapplication. And that has to be all seen through a spectrum of years of experience. The attitude I had, 20, 30 years ago has been changed by my experience and everything I've done. But specifically in fire protection engineering, I think one must strive to understand the foundational, precepts of this relatively young engineering discipline. We're young compared to, say, civil. Apply rational, logically based protection schemes. As we all know, the prescriptive codes don't address every hazard or risk. Fire protection engineers, I think, need to resist ideas that come from whether it's in their team or the HJ or wherever it comes from. Some people say, "Well, I feel we need this," or "I feel that's not enough," or we're engineers. We do feel, but we need to be logical and we need to base everything on rational scientific basis. So I think that's really important because there's a lot of people in our field that are not classically trained engineers, but they're involved and from different aspects, owners, whatever. And a lot of people tell you what they feel, and uh, you know, we don't feel. We need to calculate. We need to uh, rationalize and things like that. And this isn't really a requirement of excellence in my mind, but an FPE having a fire service background, that's never a bad thing.
Yeah, I appreciate that, emphasis on having logic and data to support arguments. I was writing a report this week, and I was talking with, I was getting or asking for help or guidance from one of the other FPEs in my firm, and I was like, well, I think that this quantity for fire flow is appropriate, based on what this rural area in Oklahoma has had in the past, which is, this is just the status quo for them. And he asked me, well, what data source does that correspond to? Because there's, at least five different ways to calculate fire flow. So, if you are sitting on the stand at a trial for this building catching on fire, what are you saying that given all these sources of data for fire protection engineering, you ignored those and decided to go on what you felt was appropriate? Like, that's what you're telling me the protection strategy is? And I was like, oh, that definitely makes me reconsider my recommendation here. But it was a good learning moment for me to remember to have a good logical basis for recommended fire protection engineering strategies, and how that should color your context for protecting buildings and protecting people.
Great example to back up what I just said. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I, and one last thing, Gus. Yeah, I think fire protection engineers always have to think about. You mentioned being on the stand in a trial. I think fire protection engineers have to keep that in mind. A lot of times someone is going to push you, like, can we do this? Can we do that? And just stand your ground. Uh, you're going to be the one who's on the stand. They're going to be saying, "Okay, Mr. Gardner, you should have known based on this as data, whatever, or your experience, and now this has happened." So a lot of owners and others might push, or it's a timeline or something, but you gotta dig your heels in because we're here to protect the public.
Yeah, it's a good point. I've had to learn that framework of how to apply that and put that to front of mind, but it's a good thing for the listeners and for me to hear again. Okay, so my next piece of advice is, centered around the last year of my career has been for a smaller firm with a lot more project management and business development focus. So, my question for you is, how do you build meaningful relationships with um, clients or building owners or people who are interested in buying fire protection engineering services?
Gus, I think back, the Bible tells us that we have to have an attitude of servitude. I take that to heart. I really try to serve my clients. They're the reason that I'm involved in the project in the first place, right? So early in my career, when I was still a fire protection technician at Ralph Jensen, we had a project where an issue came up at about 4:30 in the afternoon one day. We were going to have to recalculate uh, exiting, update life safety plans, and the architect said, "We need this tomorrow morning." Well, this was in the 80s. There was no email. There was no getting it to them easily. We said, "How are we going to do this?" So I said to the architect, I said, "Give me your address of your home. I'll get this finished tonight, and on my way home, I will drop it off." So I stayed late, got it done, took it to this guy's house, knocked on his door. I think it's the first time I met him. Gave him the drawings. He was obviously very happy. Yeah. Years later, I was working for a different firm, and I'm marketing a different firm, and I'm at their office, and I'm in their conference room, and he comes walking in, and he just stopped and said, "This guy will bring the drawings to your house." So obviously the cred in the room just took off. So it paid off. It paid off for the project back then. It paid off in the future, and it was quite a meaningful relationship because of it, and you become the trusted advisor. So you know, besides that war story, I think meaningful relationships with clients start with active listening. so many people listen with the intent to respond. And I don't think I'm the best at it, but I try to listen, and recently have gone through some training that, good consultants listen with the intent to understand. So if you understand your client's needs and you bring them value, you can forge a relationship where the client values you, you value the client, and you become the trusted advisor. But if you don't listen to your client, if you don't deliver as promised, and if you don't deliver on time, there's a relationship that will not be meaningful. And of course, we never want to deliver a project late, but in the rare case where the quality of the work product is not acceptable, clients that trust and understand your integrity will be more understanding if a project has to be a little bit late to maintain that high quality. And I think that's the key.
Yeah, that's great, Tom. I love that story of performing in an extreme capacity and leaving an indelible mark on a person for probably the rest of their life for what you were able to do for them and that act of service. But I found that when somebody is in a time of need and you over deliver, like that was not a reasonable thing for them to ask you to do, but you made it happen anyways. Like that is one of the strongest business development things that you can do, is to over deliver for somebody. And then yeah, I think being timely with your deliverables is a 1,000% bonus points every time you do that. And lots of good gold in there. So I appreciate those words, Tom.
Sure.
So this next one has a focus on project management. And, we, as an engineer, I like to get philosophical about terms or jargon or really get to the definition or what is important about certain words. So this next question is for project management. What do you consider to be like three top considerations for effective project management?
Well, Gus, my three, they may not be, you know, the folks that write the books on project management may not agree with me, but hopefully they do. For me, number one is communication. I always say to my team, you can never over communicate. My wife disagrees with me because maybe I over communicate with her, but I feel you can never over communicate. Check, check, and recheck. And this communication should result in the client never having to ask for the project status. Be proactive and keep them constantly informed. But the communication is not only with the client, but your team. The other one I would say is be immersed. You need to know everything that's going on about your project. You need to be fully connected to the project without being a micromanager. I've had micromanagers. I've tried not to be one my entire career when I finally did get to management, because we're all big boys and girls. We know what we're doing. Uh, no one wants that. But you've got to be involved. You got to know what's going on without being overdone. And the last one is, take ownership. That sounds like one of those phrases you throw out there. But my taking ownership has always been when something goes wrong in the project, as a project manager, that is my fault. And when something goes right on the project, that's my team's fault. And I've always done it that way. I've always wanted a team, Gus, that will follow you to a cliff and walk off the cliff with you. Because I have worked for people that we would have followed them to the cliff and pushed them off. So I've always wanted my folks to follow me off the cliff and not push me off it.
That's good. I think that those are great considerations. I think that the more I think about how to really be a good professional, the more I realize that the basics, and I know that sometimes they can sound like platitudes or just too general, but what you're saying is to give great focus and attention to these key aspects because it's not fancy tricks and little tips that are going to get you excellence. It's a unrelenting commitment to these fundamental things that are going to show people that you really understand what you're doing as a professional. So I appreciate you highlighting those. Um, so Yeah, this question really is just about trends in the industry or what you see happening right now. And I always like to get a sense of what people are seeing as meaningful in the industry. There's always kind of hazards or things that are a buzz on different professional society media publications. But yeah, I just wanted to pick your brain on what you see as a trend in either business or in fire and life safety.
Yeah, I'd say the trend that I'm kind of thinking about is the business of fire and life safety. So not so much a new hazards. Obviously, everybody's looking at lithium-ion batteries and such. But one that really kind of gets me is, I came into the business in 1980, and back then many design teams didn't seek a fire protection engineer. We would approach them to try to sell our services, and those design teams would say, well, we have a mechanical engineer for sprinkler, we have an electrical engineer for fire alarm, and our architect will take care of life safety. Of course, I'm a bit biased, but fire protection engineering, uh, which by definition includes life safety, is best when done by fire protection engineering professionals. Those who have the education, training, experience to understand growth, fire growth specifically, uh, fire propagation, and the resulting hazards. I've always said a mechanical engineer may understand piping better than I do, but it's the fire that's important, right? We need how to put that out and protect from it. Uh, and one other trend that is interesting to me is fire protection engineering employment opportunities in the landscape. When I came, there was actually a question on my intro to fire protection engineering at University of Maryland, and it said, name three of the big consulting firms out there. And back then, the biggest ones were Rolf Jensen Associates, Gage Babcock and Associates, and Schirmer Engineering. There were the other firms too, but they were the ones that were like best known at the time, I guess. Well, a lot of those have gone away. There's been mergers, acquisitions, a lot of new firms, your firm and others that have come to on the scene. And the other part of that trend is we see a lot of large AEs now that have fire protection engineering in-house, and that was quite rare when I got into the biz. So those trends, I think they're good for us. There's more employment opportunities, and the fact that engineering and architecture teams today are looking for a fire protection engineer. It's not being, it was forced on them through the DoD requirements back in the 80s. Um, but yeah, it's nice now that every team is looking for that discipline.
Yeah, I appreciate that topic, Tom. I think we've been talking a lot about it internally. This idea of how to sell, or should you try to sell the fire protection engineering services to a MEP firm or an architectural firm. They might not even really know what fire protection engineering is, and so how do you sell those services? How do you frame that argument? What's meaningful to those people? What pieces of value can you show to them in order to make those services compelling? It sounds like you've had a lot of experience in that, or that was the industry at the time when you were coming out of school. People really did not know what it meant to be a fire protection engineer. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that topic.
On the fact that people didn't know what a fire protection engineer was.
Or just how do you, like, what do you think is a good way to frame, like, having a conversation with a mechanical engineer who's like, oh, I know how to hatch plans, I know how to do hatching, what is there to do? Or an electrical engineer that's like, I know how to put in FBA 72 on a drawing. Why do I need a fire protection engineer? So, like, should you try to, or, is there something that like comes to your mind when you having these conversations that people who really don't understand the value of a fire protection engineer?
Yeah, I guess I've tried to separate us from the pack, so to speak. Uh, so one of my tactics often is to ask about performance-based design. The problem there is what a mechanical engineer will hear is a performance spec, right? It's a basic drawing, sprinkler this per 13, and then a specification. And I have to explain to them. I said, no, performance-based design is different than that, and that is where instead of, you know, you shall have a travel distance of X or this or that, we're going to say these are performance metrics that we have to meet, like tenability and such, and how are we going to keep that from happening? And that typically shows that discipline that, okay, because that's fire modeling, that's timed egress analyses. So that shows them that we're playing in a whole different sandbox that they're not even thinking exists, you know. So I try to take that tack sometime. And sometimes that works. Other times, I've been told by clients, we will use you for for sprinkler, fire alarm, and life safety for a DoD project. And then we're going to use you again for a commercial project. You're just going to do the life safety because my other disciplines are going to take care of the systems. I think that's going away, though. It used to be a lot more prevalent. It's still there, and depending on who you talk to, but it is going away. And I just wonder what it was like for the fire protection engineers that came out of IIT in the 50s, like Rolf Jensen, like Chet Shermer, Bud Nelson, uh, others that came out of there. We talked about Pat Brock at one time. You know, those leaders in the industry when they first came out, it had to be really something because I felt I was swimming upstream with people not knowing what an FP was or caring about it. I can only imagine, step back another 20 years before me or 30 years before me. It must have been tough, but at least the insurance companies were a great place for FPs to go back then because the highly protected risks folks, really valued the FPE.
Yeah, I love that perspective. I love that perspective because, uh, we chat about how much of a struggle it is. But, like thinking about a Pat Brock or a Rolf Jensen and what they would have to endure or the kind of conviction or knowledge they would have to display in order to get a seat at the table. And it would probably just blow my mind to think about that kind of performance or that sort of, understanding of the phenomenon of fire. But so I appreciate that perspective. And so my final question for you, Tom, is um, should individuals be interested in professional societies? And if so, which ones would you recommend?
Well, I definitely think fire protection engineers should be interested in professional societies. So the answer is yes. Which ones? The first one comes to mind would be Society of Fire Protection Engineers. Uh, I think, first and foremost in my mind because that's the society that's advancing our engineering discipline through thought leadership, training, education, and advocacy. And it's a great place for us all to get together and move our profession forward. But there are many excellent organizations such as NFPA if you want to get involved in codes and standards making and research. You go to a technical committee meeting if you're lucky to get on one of those, and boy, what you can learn from those experts around you is amazing. And then there's societies that I've been involved in that have like an engineering focus. This is like the Society of American Military Engineers, if you're going to do DoD type work, obviously. ASHRAE, American Society for Heating, Refrigeration, Air Conditioning Engineers, if you're a smoke control person, that's a great place to be. And then there's other ones like BOMA and IFMA who focus on facilities and building owners and managers, those types of folks. They're great, and I like those. But sometimes if you go to those, you might wind up sitting at a table with 5 or 6 carpet salespeople because they want to talk to the facility people too. But they're great organizations, and I think I would be really remiss if I didn't mention AFSA, NFSA, and AFAA. So our sprinkler and our fire alarm associations. A lot of folks in there are fire protection engineers, and others are our technicians and our installers. But what a great group to be with. Uh, when I worked at Grinnell, I was one of the designers. When the back door opened from the shop and a fitter came walking in saying, "Who drew this project?" We all kind of, we all kind of like, "Oh my gosh, what did I do wrong?" Because that was in the hand drafting days, and you can make a math error. And one time, one of our guys did, and the fitter said, "Look, the main going down the hallway turns and goes upstairs outside the building." Made a math error. That wouldn't happen with CAD. And of course, the fitter's like, "You stupid engineers." And we're like, "Well, we have to see everything in 2D and imagine it in 3D. You're out in the field." So it was good when we could get together with those folks and see stuff from each perspective. But yeah, these societies have been really good for me in my career. I really encourage younger FPEs to get involved in any one of these.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think we're still getting you stupid engineer out in the field, as I'm sure you're aware of. But it's just you're looking in the 3D model and you weren't even thinking about it when you were putting that pipe in that 3D space. You just thought, oh, it'll work, even though I'm in this beam or this duct or whatever. And so you still have to be thoughtful, even if it's right in front of you, depicted in great granularity. But yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's great, Tom. Well, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show, and but also open the forum if there's anything that you wanted to talk about or speak on the podcast before we close this thing out.
Maybe because we were just talking about installation issues and stuff. Just I think if someone wants to get in fire protection engineering, they're not out yet, they're going to school for it or whatever. Intern anywhere. When I would hire a young engineer, it'd be great if I had a resume that had a 4.0 grade point average on there. But I think I'd rather have the 3 point something with experience. So I would say you've got to intern. It's great if you can intern on the contracting side and get to learn the trips and the traps and everything else and use that in engineering. Think back to my sprinkler class with Dr. Hickey. He brought a sprinkler contractor in to talk to us. And the guy said, well, if you have a weld that's leaking, you take your pencil from behind your ear and you jam it in there and break it off, and the wood will swell up and it will stop leaking. And Dr. Hickey was kind of like, oh my gosh. And I was like, no, I'd love to hear that because now I know what's going on out in the field. So if you can intern with an engineering firm, great. If you can intern with a contractor, I think that's even better.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There are invaluable lessons that if you're not getting out in the field and you're not having conversations with contractors and they're not showing you the different ways where they could fool you or how they could do something cheesy on a hydrostatic test with the gauge by, or all these things. If you don't make friends with the contractors, then you are going to be missing out on a wealth of information and experience that you absolutely need. So that's a great point, Tom. Well, that's a great way to wrap things up. Thank you so much for your time, Tom. Thank you for coming on the show.
Gus, thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.